Welcome to a discussion of Massachusetts ballot question 4. I'm Mason Marks. I'm a law professor, and this is an event being put on by Psychedelic Week. And I want to emphasize that this event is an informational session about ballot question 4. We're not taking a particular position on the ballot question. And this webinar is not affiliated with any other institution other than Psychedelic Week. It's not associated with Harvard University, Poplar, Pulse, any programs or institutions associated with Harvard or with Florida State University, Roger Williams University, Yale University, any other institution. I think I'm going to hand things over to Victoria very quickly, who will be our moderator. I just want to mention very briefly, in case you are not familiar with ballot question 4, just a very, very quick introduction to what it is. This is a voter ballot initiative that Massachusetts voters will vote on this Tuesday. And it really has two basic parts. One part is that it decriminalizes various actions associated with 5 psychedelic substances, including their possession, use, and to some extent their cultivation and sharing. So that's sort of the personal use side of ballot question 4. And then the other side you can think of as the regulated use side, which will legalize the supervised use of psilocybin at first, and then potentially or I guess psilocybin and psilocin, and then potentially the other 3 substances. And we'll get into more of the details as we go along. And we have people here from Massachusetts, as well as some of the states that have passed similar legislation since 2020, including Oregon, which passed the Voter Ballot Initiative Measure 109 in November of 2000, and Colorado, which approved Proposition 122, or the Natural Medicine Health Act, in November of 2022. So that's, I think, enough background for now. We'll get into more detail as the discussion moves along, and I'll hand it over for now to our host, Victoria Litman. Thank you for moderating.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, Mason, and happy to be here. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion about Massachusetts ballot proposal. So the goal of this conversation is to give everyone here a clear understanding of what the measure proposes, some of the policy implications of it, and discuss some of the reasons why it's garnered both support and opposition. The goal tonight is really simple: keep our focus on the policy. Um, Everyone's perspectives that are here are really valuable, and our shared objective amongst everyone here is to just inform voters and interested parties, all of you here, about what the law could do and how it might impact Massachusetts and maybe the psychedelic advocacy world more broadly. So a few sort of like format and rules. We're going to start with opening statements. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers. They'll have a chance to kind of give an opening statement of who they are and what they think about the proposal. Then I have some questions I'll pose to the panelists, and they can use the raised hand function to respond, and I'll call on them. We're going to try and keep the responses to each of these questions pretty short, 3 minutes. If we're going beyond the time, we'll mute you, we'll communicate with you, but we're excited for a peaceful, friendly conversation. And I guess Mason and I are here to the extent that we can help with any kind of discrepancy or disagreement or misunderstanding about what the law is or what it would do or how it would be implemented. In terms of like the legal stuff, we're here to help with that. But yeah, and if I think I can just leave it at that, and I'll start with our introductions. So first up, Ashley Troxell. She's a natural medicine educator, advocate, and former facilitator with an MS in teaching and learning from Colorado State University. As co-founder of Psyched, a Denver-based organization offering psychedelic news and education, she champions safe, affordable access to psilocybin mushrooms, inspired by her own journey overcoming chronic illness, PTSD, and anxiety. Her work and insights have been featured on major media outlets, including Fox News, Dr. Phil, and Colorado Public Radio. So very happy to have you. Ashley, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Victoria, and Mason, for hosting this really important discussion. I'm in Colorado, where natural medicine, psilocybin mushrooms, have been decriminalized since 2019. I became a professional facilitator in 2021. Prior to that, I was a public school teacher, and my focus in education has really allowed me to provide harm reduction education and support services as a guide and facilitator. In Colorado, what we saw with the Natural Medicine Health Act, a very similar piece of legislation, was during implementation, our state legislature came in and completely rewrote the law. And so initially, what the Natural Medicine Health Act was designed to do was also have this regulatory side as well as personal use. And what we've seen since this passed in 2022 is really the rescinding of these personal use protections that were in the initial Natural Medicine Health Act. And so things like offering harm reduction, education, facilitation, and integration services will be criminalized in 2025 when this model and these licensing practices go into place. And so what this has done is it hasn't met really what the goals of the initial legislation were. And so we heard a lot about helping veterans with PTSD during the campaign, especially from Natural Medicine Colorado, which is connected to the Healing Advocacy Fund and the New Approach PAC. We heard a lot about how this is going to help veterans with PTSD. Well, as we rescind these personal use laws that we passed and we put into place these new facilitator restrictions, including one we have a tiered system. And so we have a standard facilitator license as well as a clinical facilitator license. And for example, a veteran with PTSD would need to go see one of these clinical facilitators. And we're going to likely see prices that are much higher than the Oregon model, which are already unaffordable. And so I do not feel at this present time that the law that we passed in Colorado is what is being rolled out right now. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And I will say that if you do have questions, I should have said this up front, but for people watching, if you do have questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature, and I'll be monitoring that as we move along. Thank you. And I need to fix Victoria's mic, so bear with me just one moment. My apologies. There we go. Sorry about that.
Okay. I think I'll stay unmuted and try and be quiet. Thank you for that, Ashley. Our next speaker is James Davis. He's the volunteer co-founder of Base Daters for Natural Medicine, a nonprofit that educates on sustainability, foraging, and psychedelic education. His organization has partnered with 8 Massachusetts cities to help end arrests for growing and sharing psychedelic plants by sharing stories of personal growth. Davis's professional background is in economics and public policy, inspired by his own upbringing in a family and neighborhood impacted by poverty and the war on drugs. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Mason. Thank you to my fellow panelists for joining tonight. I'm hoping for a great conversation about the intricacies of this law. I helped start Base Daters for Natural Medicine in Massachusetts because psilocybin helped me open up my heart to other people again. It helped me recover from years of trauma, and I've had the pleasure, the privilege to meet tens of thousands of people across Massachusetts, hear their perspectives on this, meet many of them who have benefited from psilocybin, meet many people who have not benefited from psilocybin or have even had sometimes negative experiences based on the set and setting in which they use them. And for our organization, having affordable, accessible, and innovative experiences has been our main priority over the last 4 years. It's been embedded in our storytelling and how we share our stories with city councilors, and it's embedded in legislation that we filed before the state legislature. Not only more cities have passed decriminalization with our help, we've also filed more laws than any other state. And so there are a lot of people in Massachusetts who care deeply about this issue and want people to have access to this new form of healthcare. And we don't want it to cost thousands of dollars. We want people to be able to have experiences at home. We want people to be able to actually start a business and help people instead of being, um, you know, driven into bankruptcy or driven out of starting that business by high fees. And so we made the difficult decision to oppose question 4 after a stakeholder process. Initially, we were open to working with these groups. We assumed that they were working in good faith. We had heard warning signs from Colorado and Oregon, and we made the difficult decision of saying, look, like, we'll try to work with them because we felt that we could fix this policy after it gets sent back to the legislature. And a series of interactions with representatives of the campaign have really told us that we're not confident this law would be changed for the better by the state legislature. And in fact, could cause a tremendous amount of cultural backlash, as it did in Oregon, where hundreds of cities banned psilocybin facilitation centers, where the state recriminalized possession of psilocybin with Measure 110. That's different than Measure 109 that legalized the services. And we're deeply concerned that the way this campaign has been approached will ultimately set our shared goal of psychedelic access and services back. There are a lot of people who will not grow their own mushrooms, who will not engage with that part of this psychedelic economy. They don't know what these 1 gram molecular limits mean. They don't know what that is. They want to be able to have a safe and comfortable experience so that they can explore their own mind and consciousness. And so I'll close by just saying that drugs are already legal in the United States. They're just legal for certain people, and they are legal for certain corporations to sell them to us. We need to make sure that we're creating an economy for these services where people can afford them, where people can be innovative in how they access them, where they're most comfortable, their preferred set and setting. And for those reasons, we are strongly opposed to question 4. And we're open to learning from other perspectives and perhaps even updating our perspective. So just humbled and grateful to be here today. And thank you again for hosting.
Thank you, James. Yeah, there's so much good food for thought, and I'm looking forward to the conversation part of this discussion. But before we get to that, we will have to hear from our next speaker. We get to hear from our next speaker, Heidi Venture. She's the co-founder of Vital Reset Psilocybin Service Center in Hood River, Oregon. A lifelong struggle with depression ended when she took a heroic dose of psilocybin in 2020. Since then, Heidi has become a steadfast advocate for access to psilocybin for people struggling with mental health and addiction issues. Today, she will be available to share her experience working with the Oregon psilocybin legal industry. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks, Victoria. It's really great to be here. I'm happy to be here representing Oregon. I recognize some of you folks. As Victoria said, I got a new life from mushrooms, went from being a depressed person who thought about my depression all the time to being able to start a psilocybin business in an incredibly difficult regulatory environment in Oregon. I would encourage you in Massachusetts to try to get this law right the first time, because what we're facing in Oregon right now is a lot of problems that we can only solve through the legislature. And the things that are happening are making it more expensive. I would challenge what Ashley said about things being unaffordable in Oregon. Every service center I know is doing free and low price journeys for people. Um, what we need to think about is the incredible value that we're offering. People are coming to our service center. We've had over 235 people, about 95% have said that they got what they needed out of it. I think that's pretty good, better than I got out of antidepressants. Um, hmm. Yeah, I would love to answer your questions about what's happening in Oregon. I do encourage you to be really careful what you put into law because you got to live with it for a long time. And one of the problems we have is that the Oregon Psilocybin Services section interprets the law in the strictest way they possibly can, and it makes it very difficult to offer any kind of a low price journey for people and still stay in business. We've already seen, I think we're seeing our fourth service center out of 30 go out of business right now. So, yeah, I've talked enough. Thanks.
Thank you, Heidi.
All right. So, I mean, I want to take moderator privilege for just 30 seconds to say that I have really wanted to get as many perspectives as possible onto the stage. Part of being on the stage right now is signing a release that says that you're comfortable being recorded and shared. And unfortunately, that is limiting everyone being on the stage right now. And that is just where we're at. And I'm just sharing that with my moderator's privilege. I'm really excited to transition into the question part of this evening. And I want all the people listening to be thinking about other questions you want to ask. Now this might be a weird first question. So maybe I'm asking for those of you who are not in support of this proposal to put on your devil's advocate hat, right? Why would voters or why should voters support this proposal? Like, what's good about it?
So I guess I'll take that one. I'll take lead on that one. There are still a lot of our volunteers. I don't know if a lot, that's kind of a strong term, but some of our volunteers that are messaging us, and they're very excited to see this on the ballot because for them, they feel like this is a cultural signal that psychedelics are entering mainstream acceptance. And for a lot of people, that's going to drive votes on Tuesday. They see psychedelics, they've benefited from psychedelics, or they know someone who has, and that's what is driving them to support it. And I can see some of the arguments on behalf of voting for this, even though perhaps people don't understand it as much as they would like, or they're not sure how to understand the almost 30 pages of it, but they feel that doing this will signal larger cultural acceptance than if it's narrowly defeated. And so that is the good faith argument that I think a lot of people make to vote for question 4, even people privately who have problems with how it's written.
And I mean, Ashley or Heidi, any reflections? Yeah, Ashley.
Sure, I would love to reflect. And so I think this brings hope and optimism and a chance to get it right. It's my understanding that in the implementation process, it will go through your state legislature. And so I would just encourage folks to get involved and make it a better bill than what you're seeing right now. And so I'm hopeful that your state legislature will listen to and engage with stakeholders and create legislation that truly helps people and provides safe, affordable access to natural medicine.
Yeah. When Measure 109 was put before the voters in 2020 in Oregon, the people putting it out there didn't expect it to pass. They expected it to reveal what needed to be changed. That's all.
Did I mean, I'm gonna ask a question and you cannot answer. Ashley and Heidi, did you vote for the measure when it was in your state?
I personally did not vote for the measure. As a guide, I was better protected under Denver's decriminalization laws that were already into law. And so what this did was it brought in a lot of dark money from out of state to create regulations that are really going to benefit the medical industrial complex more than the folks that were working in this space prior to the passing of the Natural Medicine Health Act.
Heidi, you're willing to share? You can't unmute yourself. We're just gonna have to stay on unmute and
Oh, there we go. I'll stay unmuted. Um, if I had to do it over again, I don't know if I would vote for 109 because I also did not expect it to pass. And I think the whole country did not understand the what was going to happen after we passed it. So I'm not sorry that it's passed. I think we're having an incredible time developing what can happen for people using mushrooms in Oregon. So I'm not sorry about that. Um, yeah, it doesn't. I wouldn't recommend passing something you're not sure about, though. I mean, I haven't read your measure, but if it looks like it's not going to work well, I wouldn't depend on your legislature. The problem is, like, we're all these psychedelic people, and we think that everybody knows the amazingness of psychedelics and what can happen, and it's not true. It's like 2% of people know what these medicines are about and have any respect for them at all. So just be careful. That's, yeah, your legislators, I don't think you can count on them unless you can get them in for a trip. I just do not see that you can count on them to understand, even to care about veterans. I mean, that's kind of the big selling point, right? Is that veterans can benefit from this. I don't know if they really care enough.
I want to throw in a couple questions from the viewers. One of them asked, what causes the difficulty to provide low-cost services in Oregon and Colorado? And what about the Massachusetts bill will make that occur here? And I take that to mean difficulty in providing low-cost access.
well,
Maybe a place to start is what are the problems with low cost, or what are there problems with cost? And we don't know yet in Colorado because the regulated program hasn't opened there yet, and it will sometime next year. But Oregon has been operating now for some time, and what might
Yeah,
cause
I'll answer it. I can talk about that. We deal with this all the time. One of the things is that it can only be in a commercial zone, has to be 1,000 feet from a school. In my town, which is a small town of 6,000 people, there are 5 schools down in the town. So there was a very small number of places that we could go. If you're in a commercial building, you have to find one where the owner owns it and does not have any kind of a mortgage on it, because if they have a mortgage, the bank will see that they're dealing in psilocybin and, pull the mortgage. So those two things are pretty big. Of course, we're paying a extra money for the lease because it's more of a risk to the person who owns it. And also, we have a strong commitment to encouraging our facilitators to get paid what they are worth, to do a great job for their clients. And I personally don't see how you can bring that down, because there is a very small number of clients who only need a little bit of preparation and a little bit of integration. Most of the people we are seeing are people who would never buy mushrooms at a bar or try to grow them themselves or ever do a journey in their own home. They have no context to do mushrooms in, and they need a lot of hand holding. I figure it takes me a minimum of 20 hours for every client. That's 8 hours on the journey day, and the rest of those hours are a ton of paperwork, so much paperwork, so many forms, and a lot of them serve absolutely no helpful purpose. and then just doing a good job. I mean, you can go do mushrooms with your friends in the basement. I did. It didn't work because they didn't know what they were doing. I wasn't prepared and I was scared. The nice thing about having a mushroom journey in a licensed, regulated, safe service center is you can feel safe. So weird things can happen on your journey and you still know you're safe. And the people who are helping you in most of our service centers are doing a great job of making that happen. And they deserve to be paid well. So, what's the answer to that? I don't know. I've done 3 free journeys in the last month. I'm hoping to get paid next month.
Yeah, Ashley.
And we haven't seen the impact of the licensing fees and regulations. They're going to come into effect in 2025. What we have in place now is decriminalized personal use. And so in Colorado, it's legal to grow, gift, and share mushrooms. And we have a large, it's actually a growing community service sector of providers that are offering free mushrooms that they have grown and want to share, as well as people who are willing to offer their support. And so, for example, Denver Mushroom Cooperative, along with some other local organizations, put together a community healing event, and growers were able to come and share their mushrooms. We had lots of medical professionals, facilitators, as well as spiritual practitioners that came, volunteered their time. And so you could go to this event and you were able to get access to mushrooms as well as necessary support services. You could ask questions and leave feeling knowledgeable and prepared to take mushrooms either with a friend or microdose or whatever it is that you're seeking under these new licensing structures. And we haven't seen what these fees are going to look like yet. It is anticipated that they'll be similar to Oregon, if not more. You're looking at approximately a few $100s for a microdose of psilocybin because a facilitator is going to need to sit with you for several hours while you're taking that microdose. Well, you can go to these community healing events in Denver right now. People offer microdosing classes. There's lots of gifting that's going on right now. When this more medicalized facilitation or licensing program goes into effect, I am expecting these underground, or they're above ground because they're legal, but I'm expecting more enforcement because what this then becomes in the language of regulation is facilitating without a license. And so while mushrooms are decriminalized in Colorado right now, I don't anticipate that all of these activities are going to be able to continue and this regulated model be profitable.
I'd like to add a few things, if I can, about why things are so expensive. Stuff I just thought of. We spent $20,000 with lawyers just to get going. To me, the licensing fee, it is high. It's hard to pay that $10,000 once a year, but we pay so much to lawyers. We pay an accountant $900 a month because we have to have a specialized accountant who can work with 280E, the tax code. 280E makes our lives frightening. Like we've basically had to use a tactic that means if it doesn't work, we just go bankrupt. Like that's our plan B, is to go bankrupt. We pay a lot for our merchant services and our banking. There's only one bank legally doing banking for us in the state of Oregon, and the price we pay $1,000 a year just to be in that bank. Merchant account is ridiculously expensive. We have an expensive setup online for keeping all these documents HIPAA safe. Oh, and then search engine optimization. If I want people to put in the name of my company, Vital Reset, and have my company come up first on Google, I have to pay to make that happen. And that's another $15,000 a year, and I'm getting a good deal. So it's not just the one thing people talk a lot about, the licensing fees. That's a very small part of what we're dealing with here. It's a very expensive business to run. If you're thinking about starting this business, you have to be willing to lose everything you put into it and feel okay about that.
I mean, I'll just offer like and then James, if you wanted to say just like something that everyone's dancing around here is federal illegality, right? So even if the state changes the law, it still remains federally illegal, and that makes everything more expensive, including taxes, legal fees, accounting, just echoing the why behind Heidi and Ashley's comments. James, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I am learning so much from my fellow panelists, from you, Victoria. So I would just share kind of our perspective as an organization that does TripSit for people across Massachusetts. So in our interpretation of the law, there's actually nothing illegal about you giving people harm reduction advice for them to prepare for an experience with one of their dear friends, with their spouse, or with someone of their choosing, or if we want to offer that mentorship while they choose to consume a controlled substance. There are federal laws against intentionally housing people or bringing them into your space to use substances. You know, the crack house statute that is also, you know, since the 80s also been used to restrict overdose prevention sites and things of that nature. So there are some federal laws that run amok of you hosting someone and them using a psychedelic substance. But right now, there's really no law that we can point to about giving people harm reduction advice and just being a comforting presence while they use an illegal substance. And then I will also say that there are very few arrests for personal growing and sharing in Massachusetts right now. This has been kind of the quiet part of our work here in Massachusetts is there are people who are arrested. They're often growing massive amounts of mushrooms in a U-Haul in one instance, or they get caught up selling other substances. They're getting on law enforcement's radar, perhaps because they want to be the Pablo Escobar of mushrooms. But if you order a grow bag online, you can get them off Amazon, and you order psilocybin spores, which are legal in our state and all but 3 states nationally. They're sold under the premise that they're for microscopy purposes, but I mean, it doesn't take a genius to know that that's not how they're being used by some people. And so there's not really an epidemic of arrests. However, what we're worried about is having to adhere to a legal framework that's broken. And we've seen that in Oregon. We'll likely continue to see that in Colorado. And for us and our volunteers, this is not why we risked our jobs, why we risked, and in some cases, people lost jobs for coming forward to talk to their city councilors about this. Um, risk relationships with family and friends as parents to advocate on this is just for it to become just one more beautiful thing nature has given us that has to be corporatized away. And, I do like some lawyers. I'm not completely against lawyers, but trial lawyers in the United States have made a mess of a lot of industries because that's how they make money. There's a reason why lawyers associations, there's cultural reasons too, give a lot to elected officials. A lot of elected officials are lawyers. There is some arbitrage costs of creating these industries, and question 4 reeks of that. It's 30 pages long. Most residents of Massachusetts couldn't tell you what ibogaine or DMT is, and yet their grandma is going to vote on DMT in 3 or 4 days. So there is a lot of misunderstanding. And I think that a lot of people's hopes of what this care industry can be are being taken advantage of by this confusing law. On price, the last thing I'll add is a lot of people who we can vouch for. We set up a facilitator network where we do a background check. We ensure they have training They can donate to us if they want, but we also just give this material out for free so people can give better advice to one another. Most people are not making a living off of being a facilitator. I'm sure there are exceptions. I'm sure, but most people are doing this on occasion. It's something they want to do. It's something they want to help other people with. And surveys out of Australia, I believe there was a survey on how much people would be willing to pay for a guided psychedelic experience. It's usually about $500 to $1,000. And that's generally what we've seen in our research of this emerging industry as well, is generally people are willing to pay or gift or whatever they choose to call it between about $500 and $1,000 for a guided experience. And Heidi, I really appreciate the work you're doing on so many levels and so many entrepreneurs that really care about this. And I feel like that's what's driving some of the industry in Oregon, is there are authentically good people who want to help others. But I don't think that's an excuse for you all to be screwed over by, what kind of equates to a real estate kickback scheme. The same way our legal cannabis industry in Massachusetts in so many ways has amounted to that, where we've had entrepreneurs. This woman was a single mom, tried to start a business in Framingham for cannabis delivery. She came to our events sobbing her eyes out because she was a social equity applicant. And now she's hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. She's no closer to opening a business. And this is what New Approach PAC's legacy has been for our cannabis market in Massachusetts. And we fear very similarly that Question 4 will result in laws that do not leave people with better outcomes, but actually kind of destroy the innovation that's happening in the absence of a law. We have our own legislation. It caps the fees at $144 once every 2 years, passed the Public Health Commission. It would basically have us regulate facilitation services similar to how we license counselors now. We already have a framework to license counseling, and so we would like to see that adapted to the needs of this industry. So with that,
When you
I
say
know I
you
said
when you say you have your own bill, you mean a bill that a Massachusetts legislator has drafted and sponsored.
yes. So that legislation is H3605. Some of the provisions that would actually help protect licensed mental health providers in the state is actually an H3589 filed by the same lawmaker, Rep. Boldiga. Um, H Our first bill that I just mentioned passed the Public Health Committee, which is actually really surprising. I worked in the Massachusetts legislature for 3 years. The amount of bills that make it out of committee the first time they are filed is extremely rare. That shows a tremendous amount of momentum from city officials, from our volunteers, literally by the thousands, reaching out to their lawmakers about something that's highly stigmatized. And so this belief that
I'm gonna
question
cut you
for
off, James, so that Victoria
Sure.
doesn't have to.
Sure.
Thank you.
I wanted to go back to Ashley for a second, though, because of something that you mentioned, James, which was you didn't see anything in the question 4 that would, I think you were referring to question 4, that would prevent providing underground guides, or what wouldn't be underground, on the personal use side, providing people acting as guides, not licensed. And I wonder, Ashley, if you have any thoughts on that, given your experience in Colorado and how the Natural Medicine Health Act has evolved over the years.
Just
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead and clarify, James, if I got
Sure.
that wrong.
Well, just to be clear, I'm saying there's nothing currently in Massachusetts
Yeah.
law that prevents people from
Oh, you
acting as
mean
doctor
even
coaches.
before question 4?
Right now in the status quo. That's what I meant. Just wanted to clarify.
Well, do you mean practically or legally? You mean because people are not being arrested? You mean because they're not?
I mean, practically and legally, at least from my perspective, there's no law in Massachusetts or federally that prevents someone from acting as a harm reduction coach and giving advice while they do a substance. like I said, there are rules against hosting people in a location to do a controlled substance, and yet there's nothing in those laws that necessarily makes harm reduction coaching or guidance illegal now. And so that combined with the idea that there's not really an epidemic of people being arrested for growing and
I
sharing
think it
mushrooms.
might depend on how you define I'm going to leave that one alone, but I think it might depend on how
Yeah,
you
yeah.
define to draw the line between education and harm reduction and acting as a guide. But that was something that Colorado specifically addressed in the act itself. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, Ashley. Given
Yeah.
things have evolved.
Yeah, and so that's evolved over time. Under the initial Natural Medicine Health Act, people were allowed to offer therapy and support services in exchange for compensation. They were not allowed to advertise, but they were allowed to keep personal websites. And we've seen those privileges being revoked. Denver is modeling safe and affordable access, and they've been monitoring that since 2019. There's a Denver Psilocybin panel that meets each year, and they review the data along with health officials and law enforcement officials. And as of their January 2024 meeting, there were no increase in adverse events that either law enforcement or health officials reported. And so what we're seeing is the language that's being approved by a board that was appointed by our governor. And so this is our regulatory body, the Natural Medicine Advisory Board, is making these recommendations, and then DORA is putting them into place. That's the Division of Regulatory Affairs. And so what we're seeing is many of these things like guidance becomes, because of the definition, facilitating without a license. And so we haven't seen an enforcement of this yet, even though it is now illegal to facilitate without a license. I don't think most folks have known or are aware of the changes in law, and I don't think we're going to see any type of enforcement until the licensing goes into effect in 2025. But the decrim model that we have in Denver isn't going to really work well, I think, with this regulatory model, because you're not able to commercialize or profit off of these natural medicines when there are folks who are offering these services for free.
Thank you for that. And we anticipated a lot of good questions already. So you've answered a lot, but I'm going to rephrase this in a different way and hopefully pull even more interesting perspectives out. So we know that if this measure were to pass, then the legislature would have to implement it. And so the legislature is not necessarily bound by, what is passed. And so I guess the question is for Heidi and Ashley, from your experience having seen implementation, and then to James, foreseeing implementation, like what are the biggest challenges with implementation? What should be the biggest priorities if it does pass? Maybe what lessons can we learn from how implementation happened in Colorado and Oregon? Hopefully it's been enough food for thought with that question, but I'm really focused on
add one quick thing.
implementation.
It would actually be in Massachusetts, it would be this new commission that would be established that would implement the law. And in Colorado, it is these two agencies, one that Ashley mentioned, DORA, and the Division of and the Department of Revenue. But
Well,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, the legislature had to pass a law to change it to the Department of Revenue. So, I mean, whether they had to pass that law or the fact that they did pass that law in Colorado, there was like a legislative action that then like changed the implementation.
Yes,
just before
exactly.
being
absolutely,
picky.
no, absolutely, and I completely agree with you. And what I wanted to arrive at there is that they called it an implementation bill. But
Mhm.
in my view, it's just an amendment like any
Or
other.
it's like a rewriting.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
I think what it typically whether it's the legislature or the voters that enact a law, an agency would create the rules and implement it, and that's what happened initially in Oregon and Colorado. But then the legislature will come in, and I think in both cases they called them implementation bills, which is I think kind of a little bit of a misnomer or maybe a euphemism for kind of erasing some things that voters approved. And so, sorry, I didn't mean to hijack her. That's a very good question.
No, 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 it's okay. I think clarity for like what it is, like it does get called an implementation bill. It may or may not be actually implementing the text of what is passed. But I would say it's fair to call this period of time after, if it does pass, the implementation period, with which Colorado is still in. I mean, Oregon is still in, to be fair. So I think that was helpful additional context, Mason. Thank you. And let's see if any of our panelists have a response about implementation and
Oh, I want to
legislative
talk
action.
about implementation.
Take it away,
I
Heidi.
The Oregon legislature, as far as I know, they just when it all happened, they just put like word for word from Measure 109 into the law, whatever, however they do that. And then a year later, they added this SB 303 data collection stuff based on a lot of pressure from Healing Advocacy Fund and some other folks who wanted to gather data. So that's basically what the legislature has done. They haven't done much else. Most of the implementation has been in the hands of the Oregon Health Authority, which means that, and then that's our public health agency, God bless public health, but their focus is entirely on safety and covering their own butts so that they don't get in trouble in the newspaper. So that what that meant is that they expanded the regulations and they continue every year during rulemaking to expand the regulations in ways that were not in Measure 109 and are not in the best interest of business sustainability and are not really in the interest of clients either. So it we in Measure 109 they used the cannabis model, which was a big mistake because cannabis is it's a storefront where people take stuff home, and a service center model where we're seeing people who are using a powerful psychedelic is completely different. And that is something that I also just want to I want to take a little side trip here. I know James said that people only want to pay $500 to $900 for this, and the reason they only want to pay that is because they have no idea at all the value of a psychedelic journey. They have no idea what it's going to change. I had a client come in and tell me that he wanted to give me $20,000 for what we gave him in his journey. That's what it was worth to him. He didn't give it to me, but at least he felt it. He felt that was the value. I think if we do a survey 2 months out with all of our clients, we've had, I don't, maybe, we don't know for sure, maybe 5 to 6,000 people in Oregon have had a journey. None of them that have actually paid the price that was asked have paid $500. They've all been paying between, 900 has been the low price here to $4,000. And there is one place that charges $10,000 and she's got customers. So there are a lot of people out there who want the value of this service and they're willing to pay for it. Keeping the price down, it also impacts the value. It does, because if you're doing a journey with somebody who has minimal training, you are going to get the kind of journey you get from that. I have facilitators here who have been in the underground for a decade and a half and can give you a journey that will actually result in the kind of healing that you need. And that's what we need to encourage. That's what I would encourage in every law you pass is make it possible for people to get a real great journey, not just to get some mushrooms laying on a mat in a group of 50 people with, hopefully East Forest or somebody great playing music. It's, do good, do well. I'm gonna oh, the other thing that they didn't do, and they're still not doing, is the Oregon system is not including stakeholders in a meaningful way in adjusting the law. And I think that should be in your law, that it's required that stakeholders be on every committee and that they be listened to. And if they're not being listened to, there has to be an explanation why their ideas are being rejected. Oh, I hope the Oregon people don't listen to this because now I'm going to be in trouble. Thanks a lot, Mason.
Thank you so much for all of that. I mean, it's so valuable to have perspectives from states that are just, a few years ahead in this process. I mean, we could talk about differences. We have some questions about, we're not trying to replicate Oregon or whatever, but like we're talking about similar measures, right? Especially when we're looking at Massachusetts as compared to Colorado. Any other reflections on this period of implementation?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ashley.
I would love to reflect. If you were watching the psychedelic science and saw Dr. Angela Beers storm the map stage, that I feel really sums up the general feeling of implementation in Colorado. Stakeholders were largely ignored. We had over 100 people show up to testify to, and this we had a really organized effort to engage with stakeholders prior to that, and we were not engaged. They engaged with lobbyists from the Healing Advocacy Fund and New Approach PAC, and stakeholders were not engaged throughout the process. And then at the hearing, we had asked for them not to touch the personal use portion of the law, which they did not listen to us. And so we were really ignored by our state legislators during the implementation process. And I feel like that was one of the flaws and continues to be a flaw. To this day, I still cannot get a meeting with my House rep. And so what I would learn from that is, and I've heard Massachusetts legislature is the most ineffective in the US. And so my concern would be that implementation may not look anything like the bill that Massachusetts votes to pass.
And wonderful thoughts from multiple states now. And so to maybe tie a ribbon on top, Massachusetts does have the least transparent legislature in the country. You cannot know what lawmakers are communicating. I worked in that building, and it was frankly pretty corrupt. And this has been particularly true of the cannabis system that New Approach PAC created in our state. I worked for the chair of the Joint Committee on Cannabis Policy, the lawmakers who are supposed to oversee what the Cannabis Control Commission issues in terms of laws. Our Cannabis Control Commission is now facing receivership because it's not carrying out legal duties. We've had multiple chairs resign due to conflicts of interest. In one case, they couldn't prove the conflict of interest, and she was pushed out for making a racially charged remark. There are multiple top staff at the Cannabis Control Commission who are on medical leave for harassing one another. Harassment has been, a political strategy in some of these circumstances. And so what I will just tell people in Massachusetts, as someone who has worked in this space, worked across these legislative bodies, is that if question 4 passes, it is going to get a lot worse. I would not astral project that it is going to get better. And some early evidence that we're seeing of this is one of the PAC's allied lawmakers, Senator Gomez, has already said publicly remarks that imply that the pretty measly, in my opinion, growing protections will likely be removed under the pretense that voters were confused. I think that's kind of a true pretense. I think a lot of voters are confused to the point where they don't, a lot of people don't even know how to pronounce psilocybin. They're still thinking we're talking about portabellas when you initially broach the conversation with them. There's also Chris, who's on, what's the name they made? Communities for Safe Communities, Coalition for Safe Communities, the No people. The No people have actively said that they would support question 4, except for the growing provision in it. And so I think that that'll be the first thing on the chopping block. One thing I think that should give people optimism, though, is the No side has conceded that psychedelics have value. And I think that that's a median voter position in the state. I think lawmakers have heard loud and clear from our coalition over the last 4 years that they need to do something. And so when question 4 is likely rejected by voters, or if it's rejected by voters, it's not the end of the world. We will start and keep working toward legislation. Again, H3605, which would create a much more affordable pathway into the industry for trained facilitators that still have to complete accredited trainings, would still have to meet certain standards. That passed the Joint Committee on Public Health in its first file. We can definitely, or at least I'm highly confident we could pass that bill long before this new agency that question 4 would have created would come into being anyway. It took nearly 3 years, as I understand it, in Oregon for that agency to come to fruition anyway. It's taking several years in Colorado. In Massachusetts, we've had ballot questions.
We want to get to some more questions, James. So finish your sentence.
Okay. We've had ballot questions that have taken nearly a decade to be implemented in Massachusetts before. So I'll leave folks to think about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. We're just trying to make sure we have lots of great questions. I kind of want to rapid fire a few of them because I think some of them can be easily dispelled. Maybe Mason, I mean, I could answer this, but I'll ask you, what happens if the FDA approves psychedelics in 2025 from companies such as Psilocybin? Is the Massachusetts law still needed?
That's a really good question. I think it's important to realize that if question 4 passes, the regulated use side would not come for quite some time. I mean, it would be in Oregon, it was 2 years. In Colorado, it was almost that as well, about I think year and a half at least. So it will be some time. They might not if that's assuming that we get FDA approved psilocybin from Cybin or Compass Pathways, which just announced some sort of delay in their phase 3 results. So that might push that back a bit. But it's possible that they might not be that far apart if question 4 was to be approved, and it very well might. Then by the time it comes online, we could have FDA approved psilocybin fairly shortly thereafter. And then I think that's a really good question. Is this law doing anything at that point? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, if we can, it's a good question. And if we can learn anything from cannabis, where we actually do have FDA approved cannabis derived drugs, and we do have state legal medical cannabis programs, we may end up having more FDA approved cannabis derived drugs, especially if it moves to Schedule 3. But there's differences. There's differences in cost, there's differences in taxes, there's differences in terms of regulation of it, synthetic versus naturally occurring right now, at least with the cannabis situation, and insurance coverage, qualifying conditions, who's going to be able to actually qualify for the FDA approved psychedelics, whether it's psychedelic therapy or so, a lot of question marks. And I think that we shouldn't necessarily assume that question 4 will or will not pass, and we shouldn't necessarily assume that the FDA will or will not approve psychedelic assisted therapy. I think all of it is like up in the air. And also a lot of it also depends, like what does the implementation actually look like in Massachusetts. So I think we kind of touched on that question. I think we have an interesting question for Ashley based on Colorado, or Oregon, Heidi, the DUI issue. Like, what have you seen as relates to DUIs? Or yeah, I'll leave it at that. Ashley?
Yeah, and so like I said before, mushrooms have been decriminalized in Denver, Colorado since 2019. And since 2019, the Psilocybin Review Panel has been in coordination with law enforcement officials as well as public health officials. And at their 2024 January meeting, there was no increase in adverse events due to the expanded access.
I can only tell you what the local police tell us. We've had most of the police department in our service center to talk to them about how they would respond if we had to call them for help. And they tell us that they interact with people on mushrooms quite often out in the wild. And they try not to touch them and get them to go home. So I don't know if there's a higher rate of DUI. I don't think it's very smart to drive on mushrooms. Everybody who comes to a service center in Oregon has to have a transportation plan that includes them not operating a vehicle. So I think most of our people actually are picked up by someone, someone who loves them, or they take a cab back to their hotel or home, and that's what's happening. That's all I know. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And I mean, um, I think the what I also hear about that question is I guess maybe how, if the DUI laws change at all in those states. And as far as I know, they're the same, like the state psychedelics laws don't change DUI laws. And then I guess like the drug testing question is a tough question for I think all drugs besides alcohol. Like how do we
There
know if
is
someone
something, yeah,
yeah,
there's
no,
something I want to add to that I just found out. We've been trying to work with first responders and get them in for journeys for their PTSD. And what we found is that they aren't tested for mushrooms when they have a urine test. They don't get tested for mushrooms because it's expensive and the mushrooms are mostly out of your body in 24 hours. But they all have to take polygraph tests on a fairly frequent basis, like once a year or so. They take a polygraph, and in that polygraph test is the question, have you used psychedelic substances in the last year? So we want to help them with their PTSD, and they can't do it because they would lose their jobs.
yeah, it's a huge issue, cannabis and psychedelics, employment related issues and lack of protections. Um, so we have a bunch of questions that are about basically, I think the gist of them are like we should just pass question 4 because everything has to be worked out with the legislature anyway. And so why does it matter what's in question 4 when implementation could take its own path anyway? And I mean, I guess another way I could ask this question is like, um, why does it matter if question 4 passes or not? Because we could also just, lobby the legislature to pass a holistic bill anyway, right? Like it's not like we need this. This is the only way for this law to happen. So like, yeah, why does it matter whether this passes or not?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. If question 4 passes, Bay Staters for Natural Medicine, our nonprofit that has been leading this education space in Massachusetts across 8 cities and beyond, in hundreds of conversations with local police departments, thousands of conversations with local lawmakers, we're not confident in doing that anymore because we've seen what's happened in Colorado and Oregon. These laws get tightened even more. And, as the leader of our volunteers among several leaders, I don't feel confident in telling people to continuously write and call their lawmakers the way they have for 4 years if this pack gets to run away with it. And what I've seen in the legislature is a deference to the moneyed groups that put these ballot questions forward. What they're going to argue is that voters definitely wanted this unelected agency. And we've seen that. We went through a process called substitution here in Massachusetts where we tried to convince the legislature to change the law. And it was almost just grotesque. In one committee hearing where, we made the case for changing this law, where we had veterans, we had local Chamber of Commerce leaders writing in, we had neighbors of these lawmakers writing in saying we wanted substitution, the committee still just listed us as in support because they didn't even distinguish our position from the PACs. And then the PAC, it's well known for doing this with Dewey Square Group, its lobbyist group. It packed the room with people it had hired, young students it had hired that don't know anything about this policy. And we got to go dead last. The group that, again, had thousands of people write in, had filed successful legislation. So we have no confidence, and I'm not going to BS people into telling them that we'll be able to make any type of meaningful fix to this legislation if question 4 passes, because we took every single step we could to work with this organization, to get commitments from this organization now that it would address some concerns related to affordability. And in every single instance, that group rebuffed making those commitments, making good faith efforts to change the law through substitutions. So, if you wanted a watchdog in Massachusetts or an organized mass of people to be calling for specific legal changes to question 4, that's not going to happen if it passes, because we don't have the bandwidth to keep fighting this, frankly. If question 4 fails, we have a bill that's already been filed and passed committee. That bill does not speak to decriminalization more broadly, which, again, there is no epidemic of arrests. There are very few people, if any, who get arrested for growing and sharing personal amounts of mushrooms in Massachusetts. We want to push forward on a bill that we actually think even some on the no side would agree with, which is creating a program through the Department of Public Health, a facilitator program where we set the guardrails around cost of licensing, around the length of training. And, if people want to pay $20,000 for an experience, they still can, but that will substantially put less barriers to entry. And there's no restriction in our bill on having these experiences at home. A lot of people, they don't want to be driven to the experience. They don't want to worry about transportation at all. Sometimes they want to have it at their friend's house or at an Airbnb or, where they feel most comfortable. And so we're looking at a much better trajectory if question 4 fails. And I think that's true of other states where this PAC and
people already, I'm hearing people in my ear saying it doesn't cost $20,000 although I did see there is someone who charges $15,000, I think, in Oregon.
Right. And I'm not saying they all cost $20,000. I'm saying that if people want to pay a premium for more training, they should be able to do that, and they still
Oh,
could.
you're talking about the training. There is actually someone who charges $15,000 for a psychedelic experience or a package in where is that? Not Ashland.
She's in Bend and she does a fantastic job.
I would
And
hope so.
she probably
I
does
hope
free
so.
journeys for, really, she does free journeys for veterans several times a month.
That's
I
I
want to
don't have any problem with people paying that if they want to. It's totally fine.
I want to encourage anyone who's listening in that this is before I let Ashley or hear from what Ashley has to say, this is sort of maybe some of your last few minutes to ask a question. We want to hear from anyone's question about anything related to what speakers have said or things that have not been brought up related to the psychedelic measure. Please, we've had such good questions. Please keep them coming. Ashley, why does it matter if it passes? Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so in Colorado, a recent CU Denver study demonstrated that this regulatory model is set to fail BIPOC communities and low-income communities. I think what we'll ultimately see when these new regulations go into place is that it is going to limit access. Already with these new laws, it's limiting access to support services. And so, for example, providing integration. This is just support after your journey is now considered facilitating without a license. And so we see these nonprofits that were offering free integration circles before having to change their language to like reflection circles or something to remain within the parameters of this law. If mushrooms are already decriminalized in several locations in Massachusetts and there isn't any enforcement of laws regarding personal use, then this failing could be an opportunity to present a much better bill that's going to actually provide affordable, equitable access to medicine. Another thing we saw in Colorado as well as Oregon was that these rewrites increased the data collection and surveillance. And so that would be another concern moving forward if this were to pass, is what would that look like?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I guess, I'm thinking about the people maybe that were in the campaign, people that and I would actually count everyone on this panel amongst people who love psychedelics and think psychedelics can help people and think psychedelics do help people. Like what kind of, maybe there's this argument of like, if we vote no, or if it doesn't pass, or we tell people to be wary, right, that we're going to send a bad signal, that this is going to fail, and then like lawmakers and people in the public are going to think that like the psychedelic renaissance is over and there's no future. So like how do you respond to that? Like what kind of signal does it send if this proposal fails to the average voter who's not as knowledgeable about this situation as everyone here? Like what are the risks, I guess, of this failing in terms of our psychedelic future?
So I would love to answer that. I think it's the number one question that a lot of people have on their minds. In Oregon, there is the most successful grassroots psychedelic movement in history, and it's against psychedelics. Hundreds of cities have banned facilitation centers. The state rolled back Measure 110, the measure that passed the same year as the psilocybin policy, to recriminalize possession. It has almost become a joke. Like when we mention drug policy and the word Oregon comes up, people wince. They're like, oh, well, we don't want to do that. And they have just kind of this generalized sense, even if they're not from the great state of Oregon. There's many amazing people in Oregon. I like people in Oregon. There's a sense that Oregon has failed, right? And so I don't think that Oregon's experiment really put psychedelics forward. I think people who were going to do mushrooms, by and large, were going to do mushrooms whether or not the government told them it was okay for them to do them. And then there's a subsect of people who won't do them unless there is a clear, regulated legal path. And I don't think those folks would be able to afford it and therefore become evangelists in the culture anyway. And I don't want us to mix up
want to
progress.
argue with you, James. Can I interrupt and argue?
Please do.
Can I please finish? Can I please
really
finish the
want
thought?
to.
I was
Well, we're going to cut you
No,
off, James. just 'cause
we're gonna
of
cut you
time.
off, James. Yeah,
You
we
can
want to
get
hear
time, you
Heidi.
can
You talked a
respond.
lot, James. So we're gonna do that. Measure 110 failed because they didn't implement it right. They should have not had decriminalization until treatment services were available. So what happened was the police felt unable to take people to jail, and they died from fentanyl overdoses and other, bad things that happen to addicts while they were waiting for treatment services to be stood up. And now we finally have treatment services all over the state. And, I don't know what's happening with that. It just finally happened. So that was what happened at 110. As far as the cities, it wasn't hundreds of cities that said they couldn't do psilocybin. It was every conservative place in Oregon, right? It was the counties that were conservative. It was the cities that were conservative. It was really divided on a political line, and it didn't really make any difference because people in those conservative areas are able to travel if they want to other parts of Oregon, and it's not very far for any of them because of several service centers in Eastern Oregon. And then as far as people choosing to do mushrooms anyway, the clients we're seeing are not people who would choose to do mushrooms anyway. They are not people who would do mushrooms with their neighbor or with some stranger that is introduced to them by a nice organization like yours. They are people who want to feel safe. They are people who are at the end of their rope. Most of the people we see are depression, PTSD, and trauma. That's who we're getting. A lot of times their trip is paid for by their parents, their siblings, their friends. They're being sent to us by psychiatrists and counselors. And Oregon isn't failed, but I can tell you what I hope is that once somebody else sets up their program, Colorado or Massachusetts, I hope we're the worst because you guys have the chance to be better, to set up a better system. And I really hope you do. And I think that's what's going to happen. Eventually, I hope we'll figure it out and be able to do a better job. I hope we're never the cheapest place because I want people to get really good services. I mean, it really does make a big difference to have a really good facilitator. And I can say that for myself. I've done journeys a lot of different ways in the last few years, and having a skilled facilitator means getting real results for everybody. So I think that's about all I have to say. Thanks for letting me talk.
No, that was so great, Heidi. Thank you so much. And I guess I just want to say too that, we hope, and I mean the larger psychedelic world hopes that like the price will go down for everyone someday. When like whether there's federal law change, federal tax. I mean, right now there's so much financial burden on businesses. And we talked all about that. That's passing that on.
The only way the price can go down is if insurance starts to cover it. And that has to be done through proving that this is more effective and more cost effective than what we're currently paying for in our insurance system.
I mean, I think also just like 280E tax reform, but I hear what you're saying also. I mean, like if you had less to pay less money in taxes, but maybe the business would make more money. I hear what you're saying. I want to cover.
Let me answer this one question that about the.
Yeah, I was going to jump to that.
Yeah, I anticipated that you might. The question it asks, will this measure allow special service providers only who are licensed under new regulations? And I'm going to do my best to understand. I think I understand what that means. Or define a role for psychologists, physicians, or other regulated healthcare professionals, or both. And the answer is that it's most likely to be both. I mean, it's most likely to be, I'm not sure what special service providers only would be. I think that might be like.
I think it's like a facilitator, like Oregon. Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be like they call that, in Colorado, they just call that a facilitator. And then a clinical facilitator is the label given to a healthcare professional who also becomes a licensed facilitator. So facilitator, clinical facilitator, that is most likely what will be recreated in Massachusetts. I mean, that is the intent. And are healthcare professional regulators involved in defining the rules of practice for the new classes of service providers? Depends on what we mean by healthcare professional regulators. If that means state medical boards, no. Well, it depends. I think in Oregon, there's been a lot of tension between the state medical licensing board and this psilocybin program in Colorado. And Ashley might know better than I, but I believe they have been, the state medical board has been more on board with the program. Let me go back to James while we have a little bit of time left.
Sure, absolutely.
We'll keep all our answers brief, I think, all around because we're so. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to give closing remarks.
I don't believe there's anything in Measure 4, Question 4, that would allow social workers, therapists, or other healthcare professionals to participate in this type of program without fearing delicensing. And I would just say that culturally, Massachusetts is much different than Oregon and Colorado. Just the percentage of people who have ever tried a psychedelic is far lower. The medical establishment has been far more vocal in its opposition to Question 4 and its new involvement. since its filing. And so I wouldn't say that we have any confidence, and there's nothing in question for that would necessarily protect those licenses. And, to tie this back to kind of what Heidi was saying, in our facilitation services, therapists and social workers are referring people our way too. We work with them, we coordinate with them, and that coordination requires a lot of trust. It requires a lot of open communication, which we feel that Question 4 would inhibit in serious ways. And so I
I do
think that
want to I do want to fact check that just because I do have the measure up and there is a section that protects person engaged in professional occupation subject to licensure shall not be subject to disciplinary action. So it seems like it does contemplate protecting from having a negative impact on their licensure. Well, but it's at discretion and it's not totally clear cut. I am mindful of time, James. I know you want to have more to say, wealth of knowledge on the topic. We are going to transition into some closing statements. So everyone will have a few more minutes to talk. It looks like we have enough time for 2 minutes each. So let's start just in the order of my screen with Heidi, if you don't mind, and then we'll go to Ashley and James, just my screen.
Wow, closing statement. I don't even know how I got invited here. Thanks for having me. It's been real fun to be able to complain about the problems in Oregon and defend us, and also just represent the fact that people are finding healing here. Thank you.
That's why you were invited, because you are a great example, an exemplar of what can be achieved in Oregon. So that's why. Thank
There
you.
was,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you so
Embrace-
much.
Yeah, embrace the joy. That's my advice to everybody. Embrace the joy of what is possible when people get the psychedelic healing that they need. And don't worry so much about the bad stuff, because we're getting to give people psychedelics anytime somebody wants to walk in the door, and it's pretty amazing what happens. So good
Would you
luck.
vote yes? Would you vote yes or no on it?
I don't know enough about it to say what I would vote, and I don't trust your legislature, but I don't trust mine either.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Great perspective. Ashley.
Thank you so much for hosting this and having this conversation. This is a really important piece of legislation, and I would just ask voters to consider what this may look like in implementation when they go to cast their vote. What I heard a lot from Heidi about the Oregon model is the folks that she works with predominantly have PTSD, anxiety. I am not going to buy into our really pay to play facilitator model here in Colorado, because it would really limit opportunities for me to work with most folks. What we're seeing with this clinical facilitator license is that anyone who is, for example, on an antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication, any psychotropic medication, would have to work with a clinical facilitator unless they got a referral. Folks with PTSD, and that's defined as having a PCL-5 score of above 30. And according to the diagnosis criteria that the VA uses to establish that, that's just having a threshold for having PTSD. And so a lot of the folks that I helped as a guide under the personal use model, I wouldn't be able to help under this new regulated access model. I think, and only time will tell, but I think what we'll ultimately see is with this facilitator and clinical facilitator model, it's going to limit access, and we're going to see more restrictions and really rescinding of our personal use laws that we passed. And so I would just encourage Massachusetts voters to be aware of what this could look like in the implementation process. I think that's something that we didn't really think too thoroughly on. We thought that we would be able to engage with our legislators, and many of us were down at the Capitol. We only have I think it's a 6-month session here, and we were at the Capitol for some of us like more than 30 days, and we're not able to get meetings or engage in the stakeholder process here. And so I would just ask Massachusetts voters to be aware that this is something that it sounds like could happen in Massachusetts, and ask if there are better options. I don't think the psychedelic renaissance is going anywhere. This medicine has been the most transformative thing in my life. And lots of people are reporting the same. We have lots of anecdotes that are very similar to that. And so I don't think this is going anywhere. I would focus on passing something that is going to promote fair, equitable access, and not to profit the medical industrial complex.
Thanks for that. And last but not least, James, closing statement, very brief. We will cut you off in a few minutes.
Well, thank you.
I'm being straight up.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Mason, for hosting us tonight. What I would close with is I'm extremely grateful to the thousands of volunteers I've been able to work with over the last 4 years for sharing their stories and really taking a lot of personal risk to advance this movement. We thought very long and hard about whether or not we could try to fix question 4. We thought that we would give that a try. We tried to work with those stakeholders. Question 4 is not going to get better. It would get worse if it is passed on this Tuesday. And we have better legislation that has already passed the Joint Committee on Public Health. We've shown that volunteers and people who care about this can make a difference, but not if the people who want to profit off of this care get their own state agency. So, we urge people to think very carefully about what would happen in practice. And thank you for all your sacrifices. Thank you for speaking up. And let's build a better vision together.
Got us in right at 9:30. Great job, James. Thank you, everyone, for coming to listen. Thank you for our panelists for sharing your wisdom. And thank you, Mason, for thinking up this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I really can't thank you enough for your contributions, and we just encourage everybody to vote however you feel appropriate, but educate yourself. That's the best thing you can do. Well, thank you so much, and have a good evening. Good night.